My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, with a bucket and spade and a hand grenade, we delve into the Magonium mine murders.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. The Magonium mine murders is a 28-page scenario designed for use with old school essentials. It was written by James Holloway. The cover illustration is by Ed Bickford. Interior art is by Vigilio Caliva, Joyce Moreira, and Rick Hershey. The scenario is set around a mine that is digging up Magonium, a magically radioactive ore that is vital to the war effort in an ongoing conflict. There have been a string of suspicious fatal accidents in the mine, and the mine's administrator has been murdered in her office. Meanwhile, prisoners of war brought in as forced labor are planning a revolt, and tensions are running high in the boom towns near the mining camp.
As for the contents, we begin with a colour map on the inside front cover of the crime scene where the mine administrator was slain, but after that it is into the intro and a section called What's Going On, which has the following sections. Boomtown, briefly mentioning the economic and social situation. Magonium poisoning, an important ongoing threat. Prisoner revolt, the deaths in the mine. Also a mention of the counterfeit scheme, which is something being run by a few people in the mine producing exemption tokens that certify you as a vital worker who must not be drafted into the army. Naturally, there's a lot of demand for those. Then there is the Knockout King. This is a prize-fighting scam. And finally, it introduces Alba's murder. That's the name of the mine administrator, or former administrator. The next major segment is the guide to Halbeck Valley, the locale of the scenario. And that includes the mining camp, the new town, once a small village, now the party spot for the miners when they get off duty, the old town, which is nearby but a bit quieter, and where some senior mine staff have taken up accommodation. Then there are a couple of pages on the mine itself. Then the caverns of the mole men, the source of part of the problems at the mine. And then there's the scene of the crime where Alba was killed. There's a page of investigation events that may occur while the player characters are poking around. Then we have the ruined temple, a location write-up where an increasingly unstable bandit leader and her band hide out in the forest. And then that is followed by arguably the core of the adventure, Who's Who, Halbeck Valley. This is several pages of write-ups with little portraits of the various NPCs in the area, what they want and what they know about different things that are going on. There's then a bit about Magonium poisoning and its effects. It's basically kind of like magic radiation. There is the fight game, which is about the prize fighting ring. Then we have a list of items, the various magical and other important things that are floating around. A bestiary of creatures such as the mole man and attack ferret, and NPC stats. And finally, a brief but I think very important guide to running a clue box.
Fantastic. Let's talk about our bona fides. I've just read it.
Okay, I've run it for 2 sessions as part of my ongoing Dungeon Crawl Classics game. So that was with a rather large party and a slightly different party in each session. But the ones who'd been in the first session just about managed to remember enough of what had happened to convey it to the ones that showed up for the first time in the second. Although I will admit they didn't solve quite as many murders as you might expect.
Very good. Things we liked about the Magonium mine murders. I'm going to start with some surface level things. Mm-hmm. I would say as a general matter, this module isn't much of a looker, but I do think the cover is great. It has that sort of distressed paperback fantasy novel thing that is something I've noticed more and more lately in modules. I don't know if it's just a little moment that kind of style is having, but it's a good cover. I'm really fond of it. I also like the map of the actual murder site, like Alba's murder. It's made with one of those map-making software programs like that. I can tell just by looking at it. But I like that it has like a fair amount of detail, and it seems like it would be pretty useful in play. Was that your experience with it?
Yeah, it was. There's actually it's not an overly complicated crime scene, but there are just enough different things that it's worth having the top-down view of the room, and people can point at it and say, hey, what's over here by the thing? I'm going to go look at that. It was pretty good, yeah. I agree about the cover, by the way. I do like that pulp novelette kind of look to it.
Yeah.
And yeah, generally the layout is nice and non-confusing. All the sections work, like the page flips sit together nicely, all that kind of thing. But yes, it's not lavishly illustrated. That's true. So. I think that's not too bad. I found in play when I showed the portraits to people, saying, you go and talk to this person, this is what they look like. There's a bit of a mix of art styles, but it's okay because the players are only looking at one of them at a time. And there are some interesting choices, like there's the neurotic, recently fired guy whose name escapes me, is wearing a very large turban, which is not necessarily what would be your first picture, but as soon as everyone sees it, they go, okay, yeah, I get this guy, yeah. So, yeah, pretty good choices, I think.
Let's get to the sort of substance of the module. I think that this scenario gets big points for originality. I don't think I've seen anything quite like it before. It has all the trappings of a standard adventure scenario, including a little dungeon, but it's actually a murder mystery, but it's a murder mystery that's not necessarily, the focus is not necessarily the murder mystery. Like, you can kind of interact with it if you want. It's an interesting little beast, and the only thing I can think of that we've talked about in recent times that even feels kind of similar is the Ghost of Mistmore, because the Ghost of Mistmore has several different mysteries that are in the story, and you can interact with them as you wish. You don't have to interact with all of them and all of it in order to get a good experience. You can do as you wish and just sort of interact with the mystery parts as they come to you or as needed. And it all still kind of hangs together. That's the closest thing I can think of, but that of course is not a murder mystery. That's just that's a little ghost house mystery, right? Yeah. So unless I'm just forgetting something super obvious, this feels pretty unique to me. Was that your feeling on it?
I think so. Well, I mean, I don't think so for one reason that's quite idiosyncratic. We'll come to that in a second, but I think you're right about the similarity to Mistmore. It does have a bit of a feel of that. The Mistmore one has a more intricate timeline, I think, once you go into the house, if I recall correctly. But yeah, you're right. This idea of all these different areas to explore that are connected but don't have to be so. I think it is innovative. I think that's why James had to invent clue box as a term for it, which I'm pretty fond of. One thing I like about it as well is it's a very condensed and easy enough to grasp scenario for the GM in a similar model to an adventure that I wrote and have run several times. So I wrote it a few years ago. I've run it a few times. It's about secret agents in wartime Paris, and they're investigating a missing secret agent who, spoiler alert, has been murdered. But I've never been able to produce a version of it for other people to read.
Oh.
It's much more expansive than it's a kind of 5 to 6 session job. And it is sort of split into locations plus people and what those people know and will volunteer. What James has done really well here, which is to condense the what's going on part right at the front. I was never really able to get that to hang together. So on the one hand, I'm very pleased to see this does work and I wasn't going crazy trying to do it as a design scheme. On the other hand, I'm annoyed that he's beaten me to actually getting it to work. So, it's a mixed bag. But yeah, I mean, it really works well in play. Particularly the fact that the different things that are in what's going on are not linked, right? It's not the sort of thing where, as in many mystery novels, it turns out that seemingly random mugging you saw in chapter 2 is connected to the conspiracy involving the water rights. Yeah. It doesn't hook together like that. But because it's in a small area with a few villages and where lots of people know each other, and the relationships kind of are in triangles between different NPCs, they are all connected in the sense that if you are investigating one thing, you'll brush up against the other things. If you go poking around at the bookmakers, you're going to run into people who are betting on the fights, even if that wasn't what you were interested before. And of course, the people involved in the fights do know things or have seen things that are relevant to what's going on in the mine, and it all kind of spools out like that in a pretty organic way and in a way that is not too difficult to GM, I found. You don't have to memorize loads of things that have been come across before, because each little block of what an NPC knows, it's fairly simple. It's just stuff like, I saw that guy coming out of the storage shed. He was looking a little shifty. And that's it. That's like the level that it gets to. So when you go back and read it to double check during session 2, you don't have to like re-familiarise yourself with a huge ongoing plot. It's just like that one thing you have to bring back in. So yeah, really good and really functional in that way.
That's really good to hear, actually, because that was my instinct reading it. Like, my instinct was, okay, James has done a really good job of conveying to a GM what a GM needs to know in order to run this. And this is a subtle art in game design. Like, a thing that works well when you, as the creator, are running it, that you run for people and they like it and enjoy it and it works great, but you're mostly doing it from your notes in your head. Translating that to a product that other people can replicate, like your experience or close enough to it, and very, very hard to do, right? This is, to some degree, this is the core problem of game design. But like, for me, when I was writing my mystery games, it was frankly an obsession. I pondered a lot, like, how do I, this thing that I can do on the GM facing side, like, how do I translate that so that someone else can do it? And this is particularly a salient problem when you're talking about mysteries and investigations, right? Because those have a certain type of intricacy to them that is not necessarily present in other types of adventure scenarios. And so, yeah, I commend James for that. It is a different approach. Like, if you had told me like what the basic setup was, go write the mystery, I would have done it really differently. But I like what James has come up with here. It all seems to fit together pretty nicely. It is not like out of control in terms of GM mental load. I think it's all pretty manageable from a read, at least. So it's good to hear that it is. I think one of the things that makes this hold together, and you can confirm whether this is true or not, one of the things that makes this work is that the players can choose to interact with things or not. Like, there is the mystery of who murdered Alba, but you get the sense that you can interact with this scenario without ever interacting with that very much. You might choose to go do the prize fighting scam or something else entirely, or just clearing out mole men or whatever. And so I'm curious, first of all, do you agree with that? Like, the fact that the players have so much freedom in terms of what they want to do makes the whole thing kind of work and hold together. And was that your experience?
Yes, to both. So, in fact, yeah, the players, they kind of investigated Alba's murder, never really got around to figuring out who did it, because what they'd been sent to do was to investigate the deaths at the mine, like including the accidents mainly. When they were sent off, their patron didn't even know that Alba was dead. They also got somewhat sidetracked, or they would call it, were enterprising about the whole prize fighting thing and came up with their own scam to play on the scammers. And so I think we spent probably about 25% of our play time in the scenario on that. But it was good. Yeah. And it's true. And it's also something that I feel is very important in designing any scenario, but it's a particular thing that crops up with anything involving a mystery plot, is this idea of having multiple things going on so that you can have a satisfying resolution even when the single track of the murder mystery part is going too slowly or goes too fast. Like, if you solve the murder within 10 minutes, then what happens for the rest of the time? I've written some stuff on this in the past, and so to sort of quote myself, I always think weirdly of the 90s TV show Highlander. Now, this was a show that had a few quite good episodes, and they were never the ones about whether the main character would win a sword fight with the baddie, because of course he would. It's called Highlander, he's going to win, we know that. And so there's no tension there. It was always like, the question was, it was a former friend, was he prepared to actually kill this person, or could he get the fight over in time to go and rescue someone he cared about? These parallel tracks where the almost guaranteed success part wasn't a problem. Sadly, the writers never really figured this out, and so across 5 seasons, about 90% of episodes were who's the best at swords. But the principle here is really important, I think, for mystery scenarios. And in Magonium Mind Murders, we can see that there is the straightforward body in a room mystery. But if you ignore it, if you stall on it, or if you solve it straight away, you've still got the prisoner's revolt. There is a dungeon. Well, there are 2 dungeons. There's sort of the mini temple dungeon, and then there's the actual mines with the mole men in it. And the whole wider issue of Magonium poisoning. There's the counterfeiting ring. All these different things are going on in a similar way to the aforementioned unpublished World War II adventure, where, in that case, to give another example, there's a murder that you're interested in investigating, But at the same time, you're also spies in Paris and you're supposed to be doing spy stuff, like figuring out what the Nazis are up to and what this agent was investigating before she disappeared. And also then there's the more pressing issue of you are being hunted, and so at some point you're going to have to escape.
Yes.
By having all those things going on at the same time, it just means that you don't have that really awful, frustrating bit where there's only one thing happening and you can't even decide to just go and work on something else for a while you think about it, because it's all you're doing. So, Magonium Mind Murders that takes that multifaceted approach, makes it work really well, and lets the group just choose their own adventure. Wait, that's the wrong phrase, isn't it? But if they want to go fight bandits in the woods, they can do that. If they want to be eco-warriors sorting out mine poisonings, they can do that. If they want to foil or support the prisoners of war in their rebellion, they can do that as well. And our game was a clear example of that happening, because by God, those guys wanted to get involved in boxing, and they did it. So, but it didn't feel like the murder part had been ignored. It just felt like it had been kind of dealt with without wrapping everything up.
That was my sense of it too, reading it. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I think there's probably a lot to unpack there that we will unpack in the expert delve.
Yes. Yeah, perhaps.
But we'll move on for now. Other things, I like that the clues are in bold.
Mm-hmm.
I found that very helpful. I like the who's who section. You mentioned that it's the core of the module, and it really truly is. In any mystery kind of thing, the cast is very, very important. I like how the characters are described. I do wish the characters had quotes, because that's a thing I love, is when characters have quotes, and I think it's especially helpful in this genre. But overall, it was very, very helpful and good. An interesting thing about this module, which was pretty terrific, is that many of the encounter tables are just events. They're not monster fights, or danger. They're just events in the environment. And that is really, really helpful when you're doing a scenario like this that is really more about community and a place than immediate danger. It's almost like set dressing. You want environmental events happening that kind of gives the place a certain type of life. I really love that. There's a little bit in the text where James says, "When in doubt about whether you should give players a clue, be generous. Information is the building block of an enjoyable mystery game, and finding the puzzle pieces is not the same as putting them together." I could not agree with that more.
Very true, yes.
Yes, I could not agree with that more. This is one of the fundamental insights when it comes to mystery RPG things that are bad and mystery RPG things that are good. It is the misunderstanding between what is the fun thing to do in a mystery-focused tabletop role-playing game experience. So I appreciated that quite a lot. Anything else you want to say about things you liked?
Yeah, one more thing I would like to highlight, what I think is a bit of the killer app feature here, which is each NPC write-up has a bit about why they're suspicious, as in why they might be a suspect in various criminal goings-on. Everyone should be stealing this. This is brilliant, because it worked very well in our game. I think by the end of session 1, somebody just went, "Oh God, any of these people could have done it. This is awful," which I think is the scenario working 100% as intended. The good thing about it is that, as the GM, you don't have to unveil all of those things. And so for about half of the NPCs, unless the player characters went around asking about them, I didn't really reveal those sort of things that make them look a bit suspicious. But you can bring them up in conversations or have them exhibit these behaviours that make them look like they might have killed a mine administrator, sort of as a pacing mechanism to kind of introduce, more or less complication as things go along. And then, if the PCs go digging, then of course you should provide that information that actually, now that you mention it, the hat maker is a bit, did launch into a big tirade about this the other day, or what have you. Yeah, that's just a really good thing to be sticking on all the write-ups. Some of them, I'll admit, are a bit vestigial compared to others, but I think it's good that it's on every single write-up.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. My question has to do with the hooks. There is in the module this section of hooks to get the characters involved. And that's always kind of interesting to me, especially when you're doing a campaign that this is being slotted into the middle of. But it is especially important, I feel like, in this, because the hook might have a big influence on what the players end up doing when they have some options here. So I'm curious, which hook did you use, and do you think it affected how the story played out?
To answer the second part first, it definitely had an influence on how things played out. And the one I used was somebody getting the PCs to go and find out what was happening with the mine accidents.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I chose that one is because there's actually a big issue of timing with this scenario in particular, because when the PCs enter the fray, I think Alba can't have been dead for that long, basically. You know, her office is still an active crime scene, so to speak. So that one wasn't really suitable for me because our game background of what was kind of going through a magic portal, always to like the same area, but like a different place. It had to be a sort of a long-term goal that their benefactor, who mysteriously had his own portal that nobody else had seen before, in a fancy room full of mirrors, which is called foreshadowing. So they were going through that, like using this private magic portal to get there. So therefore, yeah, it wasn't believable that they would have been hired to go and look into any of the other stuff, really, like the counterfeiting and things. That was too much sort of specific setting material. So I went for the Mines one. I think overall that might be the most adaptable one to use, unless one of the others is a very good match for your group, simply because it does lead naturally into poking your nose into all the other stuff, because the counterfeiters don't have anything to do, if I've remembered this correctly now, with the mine collapses or anything like that. But one of their number was killed in one of the accidents and therefore is connected to it like that. So it's a pretty good general hook to use. I would say, though, maybe not the most flavourful one, though, is it? Like, it's sort of the bog standard, here are some detectives to look into it. So
yeah,
if one of them feels like a really nice connection, I think the others might be a little bit more engaging.
Well, there's at least a fair amount of variety there.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It gives you a chance to work this into, like, no matter what's going on in your campaign, which I think is pretty great.
Much. I think so, yeah.
Okay, in that case, let's go to the Chain Lightning round. I will start in the prize fighting game. The facilitator of the prize fighting thing, they can like change the rules of the fight, and one of them is the floor is lava suddenly, which is just incredibly stupid, but I kind of appreciate that.
I like this line from the Running a Clue Box section. Just remember, there's a right answer to the question, but no single right thing to do with it once you've answered it.
Of the mining camp, staff numbers are down, quotas are up, deadlines are short, and everyone is working hard and partying hard except the prisoners and guards who are just working hard.
From the intro, this scenario presumes a relatively wealthy, magically aware society in which corruption, bribery, and incompetence are regrettably common.
I love it. Let's go to the expert delve. The Between Ghosts of El Paso is now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Ghosts of El Paso is a new campaign for the Between role-playing game. It's about a group of ghost hunters, the Vigilance Committee, in the township of El Paso, Texas in the late 19th century, after the war but before the first railroad came through. The Vigilance Committee is dealing with the effects of the Wounded Night, a seasonal phenomenon in El Paso that takes place in the fall every 6 years, during which time the veil between the land of the living and the land of the dead is thinned. The hunters learn about various ghostly threats around El Paso and conduct investigations in order to neutralize those threats. Over time, they become aware of the plans of a criminal mastermind who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. The hunters will eventually be forced to confront this mastermind in order to save their community. The Between Ghosts of El Paso is inspired by Western films and TV shows such as Deadwood, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, The Quick and the Dead, and Unforgiven. It also takes inspiration from Texas folklore and urban legends, as well as the music of Johnny Cash and other artists. You can get The Between Ghosts of El Paso by making a $6 pledge to the Gauntlet Patreon. Your pledge not only gets you access to the latest releases from Gauntlet Publishing, but also supports everything we create in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. So go to patreon.com/gauntlet and pledge today. It's the Expert Delve. Death to clues. Let's see what you mean by that, Tom. Give us the setup here on this Expert Delve.
I realise this might be confrontational sounding in an episode about an adventure that's called a clue box, but I promise it probably isn't. Okay, so clues are literally, etymologically, threads leading from one point to another, two definite points connected. Go see the Ariadne and Theseus legend for more information on that. So then the issue with clue-based mysteries, which have been the default for decades, I guess, now, literally. You know, I've got an early-ish edition of Call of Cthulhu, and it talks about how a mystery should be arranged like the layers of an onion. When you peel off one, there's another layer underneath of more smaller, presumably, and more pungently flavoured mystery. But then in practice, Call of Cthulhu adventures are never structured in that way at all. They're kind of a fairly linear
No, they're not.
descent into various stereotypes often. And so the issues with this kind of clue-based mystery that is the standard. This clue, there's a scrap of paper with an address on it. That will lead the player characters from the professor's study to the secret gambling house down the road, and then when they get there, they'll find another thing that will take them there. The problems with this design method have been discussed at some length. What if players don't find the clues? What if they don't figure out how to follow the threads? Typically, the answer has been to introduce redundancy in the sense of having more backup clues that go the same way, or to quantum ogre the clue so that wherever they look, they find the clue that's sort of hopping around to wherever it needs to be, which is sort of the bad gumshoe GMing school of design. And the thing is, this is not sort of bad from a story generating point of view, but there's a certain intellectual lack of coherence about it, and these methods do work.
Right.
They produce scenarios that will hold together. They're sort of functional, but I think there is a lot of misdirected effort going on here.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
It's not that it doesn't work, it's just that you could be spending your time more fruitfully on other things. Also, I think that viewing mysteries in terms of clues that point from one thing to another tend to be very precise in a way that is not helpful. So, in all role-playing games, participants have different mental images of what's happening in the fiction.
Right.
It's very common for different people in the group to be operating on different assumptions. And in action scenes, kind of social communication scenes, that's not too much of a problem, because you tend to discover and overcome those gaps very quickly. But when the fictional space is what's being interrogated, if the GM says the suspect is a tall man, well, one person's idea of what's tall or not may vary. That's a kind of facile example, but that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. These gaps between perception often cause frustration, like in there's that whole sort of guess what the GM is thinking type puzzles or mysteries. And it's why sometimes GMs think, oh no, the solution to this is too easy, I should make this harder. It's almost never the case that your mystery is too easy.
Right, yeah.
and I would argue that there probably should not be the solution to any particular scene or location or encounter in your mystery, in the same way that people recommend designing traps for dungeons that don't have one way to get out of it. You leave it to the players to figure out a reasonable way that you go, oh yeah, that would work, okay. Or, the OSR sort of design situations and not plots.
Right, yeah.
That's, I would advocate, the philosophy to adopt when either designing a mystery scenario or when looking at an existing scenario and figuring out what you're going to do to run with it. Because that way you don't have the issue where, for example, the GM has just nothing more to offer as written from the scenario.
Right.
Like the players, they've seen the clues, but they haven't realised they're the clues. So the GM's kind of frustrated. The players are making no progress, so they're frustrated too.
Right,
but then if the GM starts kind of drip feeding more, maybe you could look behind the dresser or something like that's not satisfying either, right? Yeah,
it's not satisfying. Yeah.
So that's always the real problem, and it's the real tragedy of the mystery game as well, because when you do nail a quite hard, or you make a connection that's there and it actually is pretty impressive, everybody feels pretty good about that. The GM for not having spoon-fed it to anyone, the players for having figured it out. That's sort of the thesis here, is that clues are not the correct building blocks. We should be starting from the situation and working then from the evidence as opposed to a clue.
Right.
Things that are left behind by previous actions.
Yeah.
And that's how you get good games. Now, I would say that, for example, both your own Brindlewood Bay and my free on the internet game Block by Block do this. One without a defined solution to go for, which is Brindlewood Bay. One that does have, the GM knows the answer, but it's a simple answer. And that creates a space where you can meaningfully investigate, but still have kind of surprising or emergent play outcomes, where the players are sort of deciding. They're not just kind of like a point-and-click adventure, rubbing every item in the inventory against every sort of interactable surface in the scene and going, did that work, to the GM? They're saying things like, well, hey, maybe that person who works at the store across the road would have seen something. Of course, that guy may not be in the scenario or in the notes, but eyewitnesses can provide evidence of things that happen. And so that's the space you should approach the authorial part, in other words, the writing or the GMing, of a mystery scenario. Okay, as I've said before, please deconstruct my premise now.
I agree fundamentally with what you're saying. And I do think, though, that there's a context, I think, that has to be unpacked a little bit. I think a lot of this has to do with goals. So, like, the goal of the game that you're playing, the goal of maybe the goal of the session, the goal of the GM, because I think that has an effect on how you approach the sort of authorial part of it. If you are playing something that's like a sort of standard fantasy campaign and you decide to have a one-shot murder mystery scenario in the middle of a campaign that is otherwise just about delving dungeons and killing monsters and things, I think that the considerations there are really quite different than if you are designing a system from the ground up to deal with mysteries in role-playing games. Magonium Mind Murders is a really interesting example here because presumably this is something that is slotting into the middle of a game that is not otherwise about murder mysteries. It is a sort of standalone thing. And I think that has a bearing on like how you approach it. And it's a question of like, what are we trying to get out of this? I don't think that James's intention in Magonium Mind Murders is necessarily that the players should all feel like they're having a sort of Agatha Christie mystery genre experience in the middle of their fantasy game. This is essentially just a location-based scenario that has like mystery elements and trappings in it. And you interact with those things and you maybe solve the mystery, maybe you don't. But in any case, just sort of there. That to me is really different than, say, Brindlewood Bay, which is a game where the only activity is the investigating and solving of murder mysteries, right? It's the literal only thing in the game. And there are other like sub activities that the characters do, but it all goes back to murder mysteries, and that's what you're doing every session. And so I think that the goals of what you're trying to accomplish has a big implications for like how you answer this question of like of the utility of clues and death to clues, and whether we take more of an evidence-based approach or whether we have it be very Call of Cthulhu, like everything is set in stone, everything is here, here, and here, or if we have it more free form and open. What is the intention of the design? For me in Brindlewood Bay, it's less important, in fact, it's not important at all, that the players are feeling like they figured out what the GM has planned, right? Like, oh, I've got it. I've got the solution. Here's the solution. I figured it out. And I have the satisfaction of knowing that I got it right. That's not the thing at all. It's more about very intense genre emulation. Like, we feel like we're solving a mystery as opposed to like actually solving a mystery, right? And so, as you've noted, this like ongoing conversation about mystery role-playing games and scenarios and their faults and their shortcomings, I think a lot of it in recent years, my thinking has really come around to this idea that it is much more a question of power of the medium. I think where Call of Cthulhu and other things like that tend to fall down is they are trying to replicate and deliver a mystery in the way that it is done in other mediums, novels or films or TV shows. And those other mediums have advantages that role-playing games don't have. Whereas my approach in my own game design is much more about like, how do we harness the power of the particular medium of tabletop role-playing games to accomplish this goal? And so it's much more of like collaborative, right? Because I think that's the strength of the medium of role-playing games, is sort of collaborative storytelling. So a lot of it to me is just like the question. It's the question of like, what problem are we trying to solve? What is the goal of this particular scenario? And I think that has a big impact on it. If you're just doing a one-off murder mystery thing, kind of like Magonium Mind Murders, just a sort of like little tangential thing, I think it's okay if it's really particular about where the clues are and stuff, right? Because we're just doing it one time, and if it doesn't hang together, it doesn't hang together. But at least we all got to feel like we did a mystery a little bit. If you're doing something that's much more intensively focused on the mystery genre over a longer period of time, that's when you really have to start answering those questions and asking those questions, I think. But anyway, that was a lot. Sorry.
No, that's right. I think my bit at the beginning was a little on the long side as well. I mean, yeah. I don't know. I think I should say I'm not saying don't do clues at all, right? Because coming up with fun clues is fun. Hence the term. And like, you know, so if you think of a cool thing, or like you think of a particular way that a certain bit of information might be given away, then that's great.
Yeah.
You know, like if you are thinking, oh, how might this guy who claims he hasn't been outside Paris for 3 weeks, what evidence could there be? Because the players are going to ask about that. They'll sort of start poking around the house trying to figure it out. And so maybe there are some flowers in a vase that only grow, well, just not in Paris. And then that's a hint at least. That is a clue, right? But it's a clue because it's something you pick up because you were looking for something in particular. If I can actually push back on one thing, I don't think in Brindlewood Bay you're not solving mysteries, because you still have to do all the stuff, right? You have to come up with a hypothesis that's coherent with the evidence you've gathered so far.
Right, yeah.
The difference is, like, compared to one where, like, in Block by Block, where the GM's just written down, it's the boyfriend, like, 70% of the time.
Right, yeah.
So if your theorise roll doesn't go that great, it means you have to sort of discard that or develop it and have another go. But you are still coming up with a working solution to a mystery, you know, so...
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I appreciate you backing up Brindlewood Bay in that way. No, you're right. You are solving mystery. Again, I always go back to medium. It's not the same as solving a mystery in another medium of entertainment, right? It's different. It is not like I'm reading the novel and I'm right there with the novelist and they're giving me all the things I need and I'm going to solve it by the time we get to the end, I will either be right or I'll be wrong, and that's that. It's not like a TV show where a scriptwriter has done the thing and we know what the solution is, or even like your game, right? It is this idea of, yes, we're solving a mystery, but we're solving a mystery in the way that is particularly suitable for the genre of tabletop role-playing games, meaning there's this collaborative quality.
Exactly, that collaborative quality, I think, is there. The other way that games tend to go after the wrong things is, what is it? I guess it's that desire to have the big reveal and have the race to the big reveal, which just does not work when you are the detective protagonist.
Yeah.
What's that Japanese one that's like insanely, deliberately arch? Is it the Octagon House Murders? I mean, I recommend it, although it's... actually, wait, I don't think I can say anything more about this. Let me just say it has the twist at the end is impossible outside of the written novel, right. I think you can't even film this thing, right? That stuff's never going to work in an RPG, and I think there is that desire for complexity, which is, I recommend instead you should not just keep the plots quite simple, which actually, if you look at a lot of the classic mystery or detective novels and shows, the thing that's actually happened is pretty simple. It's just always those layers of people who are lying for different reasons. You know, even in Agatha Christie, it's always, this person is acting suspicious not because he poisoned the gardener, but because he was actually having an affair with someone in that next house over, right?
Yeah.
And so all of these things are quite simple, but also keeping the detail quite low, I think. So when I was talking about precision being unhelpful, that's the sort of thing like where Columbo spots that there's no paint dripped from the canvas that the artist was supposedly painting on at the time of the murder, and that's how he figures it out. But the mistake is to have that be the thing that you've got, that you present to the players as the thing for them to figure out, as opposed to, like, if you think about other things in the genre, especially the more procedural or to be honest, Murder, She Wrote to kind of mysteries, where, like, the detectives just say, oh, they're going to go check the archives in the library. We don't find out what files they actually look at. They just come back after the break and they go, we got the guy. This is him. Like, I found a photo of him. Like, or what's the one in The Wire? They find a boxing poster of...
That's right.
Classic. That's the kind of thing you want. So, like, it's important to sort of step back and think about, apart from the specifics, like, what information are you actually giving? Like, it doesn't matter whether it's a Firestone tyre print that you found in the parking lot or not. What matters is, does it match the suspect vehicle you were looking at before, or does it eliminate it from your inquiries? That's useful information. The actual tyre manufacturer is not really. And so that's where it gets good in role-playing games, where you can sit around as a group. Even the GM can, like, sit around talking about the mystery as well, you know. Think about what to do next and what to spend your resources on and stuff like that. That's, like you say, it's the strength of the genre. And being obsessed with specific clues and having those gaps where either just the mental picture that people have is different, or even the information can be kind of wrong. I once played in a Delta Green game where the GM was convinced that the CIA was like the chief of all the intelligence agencies and could just show up and tell other federal agents what to do, which may be informally true. I don't know. I don't want to get into that, but they believed it was like on a strictly procedural level. And like, and because the mystery was based on that being true, all the players were completely lost the whole time because we were operating on a 100% different assumption from what the keeper was thinking about. So that might be the other thing, is maybe explain your assumptions all the time when you're doing stuff.
A question has occurred to me that I think is worth pondering. I don't think we're going to reach an answer today, but I am curious. How important even is solvability to the experience at the table? Because I think that a lot of the frustrations that you and I and other podcasts have identified about mystery games is that, especially in something like Call of Cthulhu, the way they structure them, is that the players' intentions can just get frustrated, and they can't make any progress on it. And the GM is frustrated because they don't know how to convey the information that will help the players get there without just spoon feeding or just being really, really heavy handed with the clues, and therefore leading to kind of an unsatisfying mystery solving experience. I wonder how important is it that you even can solve the mystery, because there are other things going on in the scenario that are presumably fun, right? Fighting monsters or doing magic or whatever. If you think about the very, very first, I think it's considered the very first detective story, which is the first Auguste Dupin story, right? By Poe.
The Murders in the Rue Morgue.
That one is famously
preposterous.
You can't solve it. You cannot solve it. There's nothing in the text that can logically lead you to the solution, right? Because, spoiler alert, for the very first detective story ever published, it was orangutan did it. Yeah, right.
It was the orangutan with the straight razor in the chimney.
And it's literally impossible to figure that out. And so that was, I think, now that could just be because the form wasn't really ready, like a thing yet. And so Poe didn't really, maybe was still kind of sorting it out, how this should kind of go, right? And so maybe it wasn't an intentional thing. But nevertheless, Murders of the Rue Morgue is still fun to read. There's still something enjoyable about it, even though you can't solve the mystery. There was an obsession in mystery books, especially in the early 20th century. The solvability was a big, big deal, right? It's kind of the thing that it's the only thing people cared about,
because Chandler did a big essay about how stupid that was, didn't he?
Yeah. It was people get mad. They would get mad and write letters if they couldn't solve it. But I don't know if that is necessarily the thing that we have to care about in role-playing games, right?
I agree. I think I tend to lean away. I'm a Chandler guy, not a Christie guy, so I tend to lean away from solvable mysteries anyway. And I think I think you're right, we're not going to solve that question straight away, but I think there are a couple of things to note about that. One is, genre-wise, you can go for that more Graham Walmsley, bleak Cthulhu adventure thing, something like Twin Peaks. Did we ever really get to the bottom of that? Not really, but following Agent Cooper along is still interesting. And you're right, the other things going on, you can also have the usual suspects or Sherlock Holmes on a train that's going somewhere kind of mystery, where there's a sort of race against time maybe to unmask the killer, but if you don't do it in time, that killer is still going to reveal themselves when they get off the train in Budapest and try and stab a guy. So you could still have a satisfying resolution, but you kind of have that, but we didn't figure it out in time to just grab him before we arrived kind of thing, Yeah,
you've just given me another light bulb thing here. Going back to the medium of role-playing games, which is my obsession lately, solvability becomes even less important because the story continues in a role-playing game.
Yeah.
If you're reading a mystery novel and you can't solve it, well, you didn't solve it. And presumably you got some kind of pleasure from reading it, but you got to the end and it's over. In a role-playing game, not solving the mystery leads to more trouble.
Yeah.
It leads to further complications. So it's a fascinating idea. I always think that whenever it comes to the mystery genre in role-playing games, I always feel like the questions we're asking are not the right questions. And I don't know what the right questions are necessarily, but this feels like another one. It's an interesting question of how important is it even that the mystery is solved and can be solved? I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's got my gears turning.
Yeah, well, that's the main
real
thing.
Time.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I like your basic hypothesis here about clues. I agree with it, but I do think this is a really, really interesting, fascinating, intricate conversation, and I could talk about it all day. We probably shouldn't do that.
No, probably not. So, what's our time limit? I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know. Here is your off-ramp, Tom. Do you have anything else you want to say about this topic?
No, I think I'd just like to conclude with death to clues.
Death to clues. Death to clues. Yes. All right, fantastic. Let's go to the next segment. It's the companion adventures. I don't have a whole lot for this one. Except I will say that, as has been alluded to in the conversation, I have a whole range of fine tabletop role-playing games of the mystery-solving sort for you to try out, including Brindlewood Bay and The Between and its various spin-offs. I want to also recommend my interview with the German story game podcast 3W6, the one that I did about Brindlewood Bay. So 3W6 has done like a whole month-long series on Brindlewood Bay, and they're getting ready to do a whole month-long series on The Between, and I just did an interview with them for that as well. Mm-hmm. Also, our friend Lowell Francis did a video about mysteries in role-playing games, and it's like been on my list of things to go watch, and I just haven't done it yet. So let's go watch it together, listeners, and then we'll meet back up somewhere and decide if we like it or not. Yeah.
If you're interested in looking at the still in development Block by Block, which is my procedural crime game I was talking about, you can find out blockbyblock.card with 2Rs.co. Well, the concept of Block by Block is that it's not about, as it says in the intro, it's not about little grey cells and drawing rooms. It's about hitting the streets and doing the work. So your goal in Block by Block is not necessarily to solve the mystery. It's just to build a case and get it off your workload. If your personal convictions lead you to think that getting the actual culprit is desirable, then great. But if, sometimes that you don't have time to really look into it too hard, and you can still get away with building just enough of a case to make it go away, that is an option as well, which usually at least one player character turns to at least once. And that is built on this idea of having not one complex case, but lots of simple ones, and trying to juggle them because they get harder. The longer you have them on the books, the older the evidence gets, and the harder it becomes to actually hit the breakthroughs you need to clear the case. So go and read it. What else should I mention? Oh, to go with Magonium Mind Murders, even if you have the PDF itself, like I did, you may not have realised that there's other stuff to go with it. So go to james-holloway.itch.io, and on the product page for the Mind Murders, you'll also find the props, which is a load of handouts, like the flyer for the boxing matches, and a caper generator, which is like a little 2-sheet, a whole other little kind of robbery scenario that seems to be in the same setting as
How come it's not in the PDF?
Well, that's, I asked the same question, but whatever. There it is. Yeah. I should also recommend James's podcast, Monster Man, and Patron Deities, which is his Behind the Paywall one. And for a TV recommendation, I'm not going to look up the episode title because I can't be bothered, but there's that episode of Star Trek where there are some mysterious deaths in a mine, and it turns out to be an alien that kind of looks like a big lasagna. So that's, I guess that would be instructive viewing for the Mind Murders scenario as well.
Well, listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. Our website is gauntlet-rpg.com, and you can support this show and everything else we do in The Gauntlet on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks also to our isotopic editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.